back to G4 Sports Talk. I'm your host, George Johnston. Recently, we were contacted by a special viewer. This viewer, Mr. Chris, is a huge fan of the Cincinnati Bengals. So we're going to go on Skype and talk to him about a couple of things that the Cincinnati Bengals can do to rebuild their team and go to the Super Bowl. So let's talk sports! We did receive your letter asking for help because, well, the Cincinnati Bengals really need rebuilding. So what we're going to do is we're on Skype, of course, and we're going to talk about a couple of things that the Cincinnati Bengals can do to rebuild their team and go to the Super Bowl.
Thank you, G4. I'm a huge fan. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you and get your opinion about what the Cincinnati Bengals need to do this offseason, like you said, to get to the Super Bowl. So, I'm turning to you. You're the expert. What do you think we need to do?
Well, honestly, when you look at the roster, they have really built up their ways from the Andy Dalton era. Now they just replaced him with Joe Burrow. I mean, they're starting to really build a young team, and they're pretty much doing a great job. But what they really need to improve on is a new tight end. Definitely getting their offensive line, which is what the draft is for. They've been doing well in defense, but they still want to really improve on those cornerbacks and that front seven and maybe other spots on the defense that they're pretty weak on.
I definitely agree with you on that. I think our offensive line is, what we really need to work on as well. I think Joe Burrow, you're right, is a great replacement for Andy Dalton. But as we saw last year, Andy Dalton did well in Dallas. Joe Burrow did excellent in Cincinnati, but he got hurt. We have an offensive line that has a lot of injury, that led to his injuries. And honestly, I think if we improve on our offensive line, I think you'll see Joe Burrow really ascend to becoming a really good quarterback. But you're right, with the draft as far as building that offensive line. How do you think we should do that?
Well, according to mock drafts, since the Bengals have the number 5 or 6 pick, mock drafts are saying that they're going to draft Penei Sewell, who was pretty much the top lineman of a few years ago. And, I mean, honestly, to me, I was looking at him being a number 2 overall pick. But for him to fall to the Bengals, that would be great for the Bengals as they could pair him up with Jonah Williams, who they drafted last year.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he'd be a good pairing. And again, they have enough weaknesses on their line. They probably have to draft at least another player in the second, third, fourth, or fifth round. But yeah, I think that'd be a very good start. I know there's some people who are saying they should draft a wide receiver in the first round, but I believe if you have a good quarterback, you give him time, he'll make his wide receivers look better.
Yeah, because they already got 2 good receivers in T. Higgins, who they drafted last year, and Tyler Boyd, who's already becoming a rising perennial 1,000-yard receiver.
Completely agree. And they have a tight end who's not great in Drew Sample, but I think he's good enough with a really good quarterback like Joe Burrow. He can do enough that he can get those tough, third down catches. He can do that under coverage that, when T. Higgins and like you said, Boyd can open up those yardages for him. Plus, if you get a good offensive line, you can have good running with Joe Mixon.
Yeah, and it's kind of like when you're on a basketball team and you got that weak spot, but the rest of your players are pretty much all-star players. The weak spot of the team isn't going to really get the ball a lot because you got all these other stars, but he will shine when the time is right for him.
I agree with you completely. And I think the problem is our offensive line was so bad last year. That's what cost us a lot of games because, even when Joe Burrow was having a great game, the defenses you could see, they would just start focusing on those weak points. You see blitzes, you see, all those things will start focusing on those weak parts on offensive lines, and all of our sacks, all of our hurries, all of those hits came on those 2 or 3 weak spots. And that's why Joel got hit. That's why he got hurt. And I think, if we fix that, that whole offense will get so much better. I mean, top 10 offense possibly.
Yeah, especially the fact that when this offense is good, they'll be able to really compete against those top 10 defenses like the football team's defense and the Bears defense, who were top 5 defenses in the league last year.
I agree completely. And they need to have a good offense because you look at the division that they're in. I mean, they're in the AFC North. I mean, they're playing against Cleveland, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, 6 times a year. They have to be able to compete with those, or they can't even consider the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, when you got a division that has Big Ben, Baker, and Lamar Jackson, you really got to compete, especially since all these 3 defenses, they are really good defenses. But what they did right was in free agency. So this year they have made really good free agency moves. They signed Larry Abinage, who last year was on the Browns. He was a key piece to the Browns defense. Trey Hendrickson, a really underrated defensive end, and we're going to talk more about him later. And then they also got Eli Apple, another really underrated cornerback.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I know that, I've heard a lot of people complain about some of the signings, but, I think, you really know your sports at G4, and I love this about you, is that I think it's the fit. All those players, will fit their defensive system really well, and I think that they will be better than they were even last year in the Bengals defensive system. So they will have, I think, a better defense this year. And, with an improved offensive line and a good defense, I think the Bengals could really surprise this year.
Yeah, and then last year they signed 2 more good players. They signed an underrated nose tackle, DJ Reader, who was formerly on the Houston Texans.
Mm-hmm.
And then they signed a very young but Pro Bowl caliber strong safety in Von Bell, who was formerly on the New Orleans Saints.
Exactly. And Von Bell, I think was, a real good get for us. He was supposed to be a good safety, and he ended up being one of the best safeties in the league. And Reader was excellent. He got injured, as you know, but in the I think 6 games he played in, he was I think one of the top-rated defensive tackles in the 6 games he played in. So to get those guys back with more experience in our system, they're going to have I think they're going to be an underrated team. And again, that's not even counting what they're going to do in the draft this year.
Yeah, well, speaking of the draft, I really want to look at last year's draft, and their top 2 players in last year's draft was, of course, Joe Burrow and T. Higgins. Joe Burrow averaged 2,688 passing yards, which isn't good, but isn't bad. If he didn't get injured, that might have turned in 3,000, maybe even 4,000 passing yards, 13 passing touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and a passer rating of 89.8, which really isn't bad stats.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, as we started saying from the very beginning, he had a really bad offensive line. He only had 2 players that really were that good. And when you have 3 out of 5 offensive linemen are not even back starting on the team, he was getting pressured all the time. To have those type of stats, that's a sign he's a good quarterback. So I think that, for him to do as well as he did, I think shows us we have a really good quarterback, which is the first time we've had a great quarterback. And as long as I can remember as a Bengals fan.
Yeah, and then they also got him another young, great wide receiver in T. Higgins, who did average 67 receptions, 908 receiving yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns, which is almost a 1,000-yard receiver. I mean, that was more than Julio Jones in the same season.
Yeah, I know. And again, I think that what you saw especially was that T didn't have any receptions, if I remember correctly, I think in his first game, because he didn't play in San Diego, which was their first game of the season. He only had 1, I think, in the second game of the season. So he really did all of that with Burrow in only like 8 games. So he is, I think, going to be a great player for us. And with Boyd, I think next to him, T has the potential to be a real star as well. So we got 2 potentially great players in last year's draft. That's a huge win for us.
Yeah, they definitely have to get Penny Sewell to upgrade their offense and maybe even become a top offense. And then we can move on into the coaches, which is one of the most important parts of the football team, and maybe even the most. You've seen guys like Bill Belichick, in my opinion, the greatest head coach of all time. You've seen Bill Walsh, Pete Carroll, a ton of guys like that. And when they fired Marvin Lewis, that might have been that was a great choice. I mean, he's a good coach and all, but he really couldn't find the Bengals any success. And then when they hired Zach Taylor, he was a great replacement, but the only reason why he didn't win that much games was because, well, Joe Burrow got injured and they had nobody to really replace him.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that people forget, and you kind of touched on it, is that, Zach Taylor brought in a team that was a lot of older players that were left over from Marvin Lewis's teams, and we got later Geno Atkins, Carlos Dunlap, and a lot of older players. And if I remember correctly, I think the Cincinnati Bengals have like the third or fourth youngest team in all of football, and they keep getting younger. And the intention is that he's really trying to remake this team his own. And I don't think Zach Taylor's necessarily the best coach in football, but I think that now that he has the players on his team that are kind of the players he needs, and they're no longer Marvin Lewis's players, I think you're going to see how good of a coach he really is. And I think he's not a top 10 coach, but I think he's a good enough coach to do something.
Yeah, and then speaking of those backups, they have to build up those backups. Yeah. It's not only about those flashy stars on the starting lineup. What if one of them got injured, just like Joe Burrow got injured? They had nobody to replace him for the rest of the season. I mean, there's guys like Ryan Finley, but they failed the season. They have to get those good backups in free agency, trades, and even the draft. That way, they'll have a good backup to replace him, and maybe even for the rest of the season, and they can still get those wins and more wins and more wins.
Yeah, and you said earlier Bill Belichick, and that's what makes Bill Belichick the greatest head coach of all time. He can lose a talented player, and he can still take a not as good player and find a way to get the best out of their talent. Zach Taylor needs to have better talent, and right now the Bengals just don't have the depth to lose a Joe Burrow or lose a T. Higgins or a talented player like that and still be successful. But hopefully in this year's draft, they'll do a little bit better. Again, we had, Burrow and T. Higgins, and that really made us better. But we need to get better in that 3rd through 7th round, because that's where a team really goes from being a good team to a playoff team to a Super Bowl team, I think. And the Bengals haven't done well in the last couple of years, because that's where you build your depth, and that's where you really become a team that can have a chance to do something.
Yeah, well, speaking of those late round picks, the first 2 draft picks, they're normally those flashy draft picks like Joe Burrow and T. Higgins last year. But when it comes to 3rd through 7th and undrafted players, you did see a huge draft deal last year, who might have been one of the best draft deals of all time, in James Robinson, who was a 1,000-yard running back in his first season. And you've seen Hall of Famers go in 3rd through undrafted rounds. You've seen Tom Brady, Shannon Sharp, and Antonio Brown. They've all gone in those huge later rounds. So if the Cincinnati Bengals can still get those good 1st and 2nd round draft picks, but also get a very talented 3rd through 7th through undrafted draft class, then they could be a perennial playoff team.
Yep, I think you're exactly right. We just need to get some good starting players, and like I said, good backups, because that's what we need, and we don't have those. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, who wouldn't like to get a Tom Brady in the 3rd round? But if we can just get good starters in the 3rd to 7th round, I think that alone would be a good, a victory for us.
Yeah, and when I play Madden, I don't really focus on the 90s and upper 80s players, although they are really good to get. I mostly focus on those 70s and lower 80s and lower players, so I can still build up that backup team while also chopping off players who we don't need on the team, so we can save money and get enough money to still get those backup players. And then in the draft, when I see those like 68 overalls and like in that upper 60s, I normally try to pick them up because they can quickly develop into a 70 overall and maybe even higher, maybe even get to an 80 overall or maybe even a 90 overall. You never know what happens. You just have to take the risk.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the Patriots took Tom Brady, who is like a a a huge steal. They took the risk and it paid off with 6 Super Bowl wins.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I did a mock draft recently, for the Bengals, and that's what I had them doing in the 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds. You take players who have talent but need to be coached up, and they need to kind of, spend a year or two kind of learning the NFL game, and that's what you hope for. That you have good coaching that can maybe get those players prepared, and to become, like you said, if it's compared to Madden, go from 60 to 80, from 70 to 90. And I agree with you. We just haven't done that in the last couple of years. But you're exactly right.
Yeah, and then I told you that we were going to talk about Trey Hendrickson, and now
Mm.
it's the point where I want to talk about him. So last year he had 13.5 sacks, which was tied for second in the NFL with the Defensive Player of the Year, Aaron Donald. Now, anyways, Trey Hendrickson also had 1 forced fumble and 25 tackles. Now, people still have doubts about him, but I say that once he can really develop into with this Cincinnati Bengals team, a very young team, he will definitely develop into a Pro Bowl talent. And I think he actually made the first team All-Pro last year, so he's definitely going to become a Pro Bowl talent in the years to come.
That's good to hear because I was not so sure about the signing at first, but the more I've heard about him from people like yourself and other experts, is I feel a little bit more comfortable about him because I think that he will continue to grow. Because I forgot, he hasn't played that much, and this is the first time we got to see him as a full-time player this year. And I think he's going to continue to grow as a player. You're right. And I'm a little bit more comfortable about him and how he'll look this year in the Bengals and the following years as well. So his contract.
When you said about Geno Atkins that he was on that Marvin Lewis team, they have recently released him from the team, but no one has picked him up, and he could be resigned if he was not picked up. Now, I think for his replacement, since they already got Larry Abinage, who plays the same uh, position as him, defensive tackle, he could become his replacement as he is a young perennial talent that you don't really see every April. So I think he could be a good replacement. And they also do have to get new cornerbacks. I mean, that is one of their weaknesses. If they don't get new cornerbacks, you're gonna have wide receivers like DeAndre Hopkins and Michael Thomas just catching one-handed catches on them. So they really got to build up their cornerback stash, and that can happen through trades, free agency, and the draft.
Mm-hmm. I agree because they've signed 3 cornerbacks in free agency the last couple of years, but every time I tell somebody if you're having to sign players in free agency, it's because you're not drafting well. And you can have 3 really good cornerbacks, but in the NFL, everybody loves to pass, and there's always so many good wide receivers. 3 cornerbacks are not enough. You need 4 or 5 really good cornerbacks. So 3 is not enough. We need two more in the draft. So I would not be surprised if we draft another one. I wouldn't be surprised a bit, if we go defense, even though we have so many offensive line needs as well. So yeah, I think we're going to definitely hit that hard.
Now with Andy Dalton's replacement, of course, Joe Burrow. The season before he came to the NFL, that might have been the best season by a college quarterback ever. But because he got injured, he couldn't show off the rest of his talent for the rest of his season. So right now he's not really at that Andy Dalton level that led the Bengals to a bunch of playoffs with AJ Green. But as he gets higher and higher into the NFL and gets more and more experience, he will get to Andy Dalton level and maybe even higher.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I think that's why they obviously drafted Joe Burrow. Is that I think that he has the ability to become much better than Andy Dalton, and that's what you want, because Andy Dalton was good enough to get to the playoffs, but Andy Dalton had to have so much talent around him to get do anything in the playoffs. Joe Burrow has the ability to get you to the playoffs and win in the playoffs and get you to the Super Bowl and do something. And that's the big difference. That Joe Burrow, but as we saw last year, if you get injured, you can't do anything. So we got to get Joe Burrow some people on the line to protect him.
Yeah, definitely. I also focus on his potential. Joe Burrow had the potential of Zion. I mean, they both have the same exact potential, but when you look at their first season, they're pretty much identical. They showed off, they both got injured, but in their second season, which Zion's already in his second season, they will have more talent. I mean, you've already seen Zion make an All-Star.
Mm-hmm.
You won't know what he will do in the future because he had the hype of LeBron. Now for Burrow, it's the exact same thing. But he will continue to get better until he gets to that level where he is a Hall of Famer.
Right. I think that's the difference. I think Joe Burrow showed what he's capable of doing in college. That's why the Bengals drafted him. And you saw in that first year playing behind a horrible offensive line, and with his star running back, Joe Mixon, out for most of the season. I think that you saw he has that potential. Just like you said, I think you're right. He had showed a little bit of that Zion style talent. He has the ability to be a great quarterback, and I think you're going to see it this year and hopefully for years to come. And again, if we get some protection around him and beef up that defense so he's not always playing from behind, I think you're dead on.
I think we've actually done everything we can to help you and your Bengals. Thank you for reaching out.
Thank you. I think your advice is really good, and I hope the Bengals take that advice, and I think that'll help us improve this year. Thank you, and have a good day, buddy. Talk to you later, G4.
Bye. Well, folks, that was a great conversation between me and Mr. Chris. If this thing works out, we're going to bring more of our fans onto the channel. So if you have any special requests, contact us at Instagram, Twitter, or just send us an email. If you like this video and you want to see more of our videos, you better hit the subscribe button, smash the like button, and turn on those notifications so you never miss another one of our videos again. I'm G4 Sports Talk, and I'll see you next time.